Today's reading from the Gospel of Mark is an exception to a rule. Most of the stories in Mark, as you know, are short and punchy. Mark tells many of the stories with such brevity that oftentimes we blow past them as if they were fence posts we pass along the highway. Today's story, though, is uncharacteristically long, and it is so filled with meaning and possibility that I could do a month of sermons on this one story alone. But today, I'll focus in on just one element. Hello, I'm Stuart Baskin, pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Tyler, Texas, and this is your daily devotional for Thursday, January 12th, 2023. I remember studying this passage in Sunday school when I was maybe a third or fourth grader. Honestly, looking back, it is one of the very few Sunday school lessons I still actually remember from my childhood and youth. The story concerns the healing of a paralyzed man. You'll recognize it instantly. It is the last of a series of healing stories at the very beginning of the Gospel of Mark. You'll recall that Jesus has taught in the synagogue in Capernaum, his home base. Then he casts an unclean spirit from a man in the synagogue. He returns to Simon and Andrew's home where he heals Simon's mother-in-law. Then after sunset, and hence just after the end of the Sabbath, many people come to the house for the healing they have heard Jesus can perform. Then the next morning he goes out early to pray, and the disciples find him to tell him that people are looking all over for him. His response is to say that it is time to visit the other towns around the lake shore. Then, while they're on the road, he encounters a leper and heals him. Now we apparently leap ahead by a few days. That's where we pick up the story. When Jesus returned to Capernaum after some days, it was reported that he was at home. So many gathered around that there was no longer room for them, not even in front of the door. And he was speaking the word to them. Then some people came, bringing to him a paralyzed man, carried by 4 of them. And when they could not bring him to Jesus because of the crowd, they removed the roof above him. And having dug through it, they let the man down on the mat on which the paralytic lay. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Now, some of the scribes were sitting there, questioning in their hearts, "Why does this fellow speak in this way? It is blasphemy. Who can forgive sins but God alone?" At once, Jesus perceived in his spirit that they were discussing these questions among themselves. And he said to them, "Why do you raise such questions in your hearts? Which is easier, to say to the paralytic, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Stand up and take up your mat and walk'? But so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins," he said to the paralytic, "I say to you, stand up, take your mat, and go to your home." And he stood up and immediately took the mat and went out before all of them, so that they were all amazed and glorified God, saying, "We have never seen anything like this." Well, you can see why this was such a memorable lesson when I was growing up. Our Sunday school teacher had us construct a diorama of the scene using, as I recall, construction paper, toothpicks, string, and modeling clay. I remember building a square, one-story structure in the Spanish mission style that I was familiar with in San Antonio. I fashioned a pallet with toothpicks, complete with a modeling clay man, and left a portion of the roof open. Needless to say, it was the vivid details of the story that drew me in. And there's the lesson for this day. The story literally invites us to step into the scene, to drop into the middle of the crowd like the paralyzed man in order to see Jesus ourselves. Interestingly enough, there is a modern church built right over what is believed to be this very house in Capernaum. In fact, the ruins that you can see underneath are from a Byzantine church dating from the 5th century, beneath which are the ruins of an earlier 1st century church and house. Clearly, the church early on regarded it as the home of Simon Peter. It is very likely the site of the very first Christian church. The ruins of the 5th century church themselves are octagonal, measuring perhaps 40 or 50 feet across. But it is the modern church built over them that's on massive stilts that is so fascinating. I have to be honest, it tends to offend our modern American sensibilities because we want to see things in their pristine condition. But a lot of holy sites in Israel are treated not as historical artifacts the way we would treat them, but as places of pilgrimage. Indeed, the church built over Peter's house is called the Pilgrimage Church of St. Peter. The reason the church is so interesting, and the reason for this digression on my part, is that in the middle of the sanctuary, which is also built as an octagon, is a glass floor, enabling pilgrims to look straight down into the structure below, just as the friends of the paralyzed man would have done in this story. Although I would rather they had left the site untouched, the modern church does remind us that we are invited not only to read this story and all the stories of Jesus, we are invited into the stories themselves, so that we experience them not from a distance, not at third person, but firsthand, first person. Not then, but now. Tomorrow, Jesus calls a tax collector to be a disciple. But for now, may God continue to bless you and keep you in all that you do this day and in all the days ahead.